today. So I am Gabby Oliveira, and I'm a parent at Mitchell. I have a kindergartner and a third grader, and along with my dear friend and now co-organizer of everything, whether you like it or not, right? We're super excited to host this event here today. And I'll let Megan introduce herself.
Thank you, Gabby. So again, hi everybody. I'm Megan Coons, and I'm also a parent Needham. I have, again, a kindergartner, two boys, kindergarten and third grade, and that's one of the commonalities that we share. But thank you so much, and thank you to Representative Denise Garlick, who I spot in the crowd.
All right, everybody. So today's event is a follow-up to our first event that we did at the James in July, which was a fundraiser that we did with the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Gun Violence Prevention. And during that event, really the impetus behind it was what happened in Uvalde in Texas. And Megan and I really thought about what can we do, what kind of event, or how can we get organized and partner with a particular center that has high impact, because they do research, which informs policy, and that's something that we both really agree that evidence kind of leads a lot of the decisions. So we did that first event in July, and then we thought about how can we make something that is also educational, that can benefit a different audience, a different public, and so thus we're here today. So as members of society, as parents, we are concerned. Gun violence is a public health crisis, taking the lives of 40,000 Americans a year. Mass shootings account of 0.02% of gun-related deaths. Suicide by gun account for more than half of gun deaths. This year, gun violence eclipsed motor vehicle accidents as the leading cause of death for kids under 21. So that statistics for me is always very striking. So tonight's event is really about showing that we can collaborate, right? So we have healthcare folks as our doctors here, we have our superintendent, and we have also law enforcement, right? To kind of show that it's not just about the school, it's not just about the home, but we have to work together for better solutions. So before I introduce the speakers, I just would like to thank everybody who helped make this event a reality today. So first, Dr. Goodenkamp, who took an email and called me back. So I really appreciate you calling me back. He does that, so that's great. So make him call you back, okay, everybody? Also Joyce Wiggin, who has been so helpful, you know, setting up the space for us. Also Hazel Bakery, who so nicely got us all the cookies that you'll be taking home with you today. So Hazel is delicious, as you all know. And also Representative Denise Garlick, the Needham channel, who's here with us recording this. So everything will be recorded and available through a YouTube link. And also thank you to the members of MGH who have helped us with logistics, and our friends who are at the registering table and who are here with us today all around. Thank you for being here with us today in our journey. So just a few things before I introduce the panel. What we're going to talk about tonight is not easy, right? So we really want the conversation to be productive and to be constructive. So we really hope folks are into an honest and open conversation, but do keep your hearts and your minds open, right, about the things that can change or how you can get inspired by what we're going to learn here today. So the panelists tonight were briefed, and we had a meeting before, so we're super organized. And the two questions we had them think about was, first, what is the role of superintendent, police chief, gun violence prevention center, right? Fill in the blank. What is their role in preventing violence, gun violence in our community? And what can we do as members of the community? How can we work together? What are the solutions that we can do? So one in terms of their role, and the other one, what are the applied, what's the applied bottom line, right, of what we're gonna do? So each panelist will have 10 minutes. You're all with us, right, for the 10 minutes? Yes. And Megan is here. She's a great enforcer of time. So keep an eye on her. She'll keep an eye on you. And then, so each panelist will have 10 minutes to present. And then we're going to really want to spend time, hopefully 30 minutes, on our Q&A. And so you may come to the microphone if you'd like and ask the question. If you're not feeling like it, you can use one of the cards that are on the registrar's table. And then our volunteers here, can you raise your hand? Allie, Kristen, Carla. Just give it to them. You can give them the cards and they'll bring it to us here. And we'll pose the questions to the panelists. We'll help orient the question of who it's for. You can ask one panelist, all of them. You make the decision. All right? So now I'm going to introduce the speakers. I promised you it was going to be brief, and I'm going on and on. Am I okay? All right. I like a microphone. What can I say? All right, so our first speaker, Dr. Peter Maciacos, is a pediatric general and thoracic surgeon at Mass General. He's also an associate professor at Harvard Medical School and the co-founder of the Center for Gun Violence Prevention. He has aided in the development and passage of several forward-thinking injury prevention laws and continues to work alongside the Massachusetts legislature and Congress. So welcome, Dr. Peter Maciacos. We also have Dr. Cornelia Griggs, who's also a pediatric surgeon, a board-certified critical care specialist. She completed her general surgery and critical care training at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and then after graduation from residency, she completed a second fellowship in pediatric surgery, because you just want to keep studying, right? I love it. At the Children's Hospital of New York, Columbia University Medical Center. She devotes her academic time to health services research. We also have our own Dr. Dan Gutekunst, who's our superintendent of the Needham Public Schools since 2006. And as I was digging through his bio, I also learned he has been a teacher, an English teacher. He was the chair of departments before he joined as superintendent. He has a BA in English from the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, and a master's degree in education administration from Loyola Marymount in LA, and a doctoral in education administration from Boston College. So thank you again for being here. And finally, we have our Deputy Chief, Chris Baker, who has been with the Needham Police Department for almost 26 years, right? That's what we gathered. He has specifically dealt with firearms licensing since approximately 2006. So the great person to ask lots of questions as well. He also oversees the Needham Police Department training, and he holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree in criminal justice and law enforcement administration. So please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight. All right, so we're going to start with Dr. Maciacos. Thank you.
Do I have to do anything here? I'm a surgeon. I can't figure out a microphone. We're on? Okay. First, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. This is not something that we would have seen 10 years ago. Having a Wednesday night event at a public school and to talk about such an important topic. I've been a surgeon now for nearly 30 years, and I started my training at Boston City Hospital at the time that Boston City Hospital was Boston City Hospital in the 90s. And gun violence in Massachusetts was pervasive, I'd say. Things have changed thanks to the people like Representative Garlick. We have one of the most robust numbers of laws in the country. And you know, you can't knock that. With respect to what's been done over the last 20 years. However, there are populations in Massachusetts that still feel disenfranchised regardless of the fact that there are so many laws. And what we've tried to establish in building this center is to try to better understand our community, try to better understand how we can raise the voices of those people who dodge bullets for a living, and identify the places where we really need to throw resources so that doesn't happen. I was talking to Representative Garlick just earlier, and I made a statement, and I don't want to dwell on the fact that we aren't safe. We're pretty safe here. The fact that we have 40 deaths a year in Boston is only surpassed by Hawaii. However, there are 450 people that are shot every year in Boston, and we take care of them in the Boston hospitals. It's less likely to happen in the community. But there are over 2,000 911 calls for gunshots fired in Boston every year, which affects the neighborhoods that are most affected by that. And you could imagine those neighborhoods being Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. So as part of our center, we're trying to understand the consequences of the lights and the sirens in the middle of the night and the kids not being able to sleep and missing school the next day and dealing with the consequences of dodging bullets for a living. That's part of our program. But with that said, we also want to understand what's happening in the community. And we're in a school, and we're going to talk about the idea of gun violence as schools are exposed to them now almost always in the news media and television. The 19 days that followed the Uvalde shooting, there were over 2,300 people killed in the United States. The tragedy that happened in the school is a tragedy. The tragedy that happens every day is also something that we have to better understand, and we don't have the answers. That's why we formed the center, to try to figure it out. And it's with people like the chief and the superintendent and Cornelia that we have the idea of trying to get our heads around this idea of gun violence in order to prevent it. I was introduced as an injury prevention person, and I have spent the last 15 years at the State House helping with legislation that prevents injuries, most commonly injuries that happen to children. For example, child restraint seats in the cars and seat belts, and the idea of ATV laws prohibiting the use of ATVs in young kids. The junior driver's law, I'm a father of 2 children. One's now 19, one is 13. The 19-year-old, I had to sit through the class that I actually helped make so that I can listen to them tell me what the kid can do or can't do. But the idea of that legislation has cut the number of injuries in kids by half the year that it happened. And that's the power of legislation. It also has enabled people to understand the problem better, because you have to sit in the classroom and you have to understand what happens. And you have to understand what happens with kids who are driving at the formative ages where they're still learning how to. My 13-year-old is on the other spectrum. He's not quite a driver, and he goes to elementary school, or actually middle school now. And he doesn't go to school on the days that active shooter drills are announced. He stays home. And to me, that's devastating, to have to deal with that kind of fear in a child. So we don't understand what the active shooter drills do to kids yet. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand it. But if I'm going to frame this in a conversation of injury prevention, what we know is the gun in the home that's unsecure, whether it's stored incorrectly or left on a table, is the vehicle for these injuries to happen, whether they're mass shootings in schools or suicide. The numbers of kids that are committing suicide now has increased by about 14% in the last year. The only thing we know in the gun violence prevention sphere is that access to lethal means increases the risk of completing suicide by 3-fold. That's the only data that's legitimately accessible to us. And the fact that kids take the guns that are unsecured out of the house, whether they're legally or illegally acquired, and shoot up a school, or have interpersonal violence with that weapon. So I can't answer all the questions tonight. I'm posing these thoughts to you to understand where we're coming from and anticipating an answer to the questions. But if you're going to focus on one thing, if I had to change things, and there is a child access prevention law in Massachusetts where the owner of the gun has to secure the weapon. If I had to change one thing, it would be talking to the kids in the formative years about the access to guns and figuring out how to deal with the fact that they shouldn't have them and they should be avoiding them if they can, so that the suicides don't happen. I'll leave you with one thought. We were taught in medical school that suicide was a plan. And it's quickly becoming realized that it isn't much of a plan for kids. It's impulse, just like you would expect any kid to impulsively drive off the road. Access to a gun is affording them the impulse to complete the act. We now have sort of matched suffocation with gun violence, gun access suicides in kids under the age of 15. The thought of suicide to completion in a child is about 10 minutes. I'll leave you with that, because access to a gun can happen. And if they find it and do it, they're not going to survive it. The survivability of a gunshot wound is about 5%. So unlike other mechanisms of suicide attempts, gun access is one that's completed almost always. It's a morose topic, but this is the kind of conversation we have to have in the pediatrician's office, in the clinic, in the home, in the school. And I'm going to leave it to Cornelia to continue that conversation about how we propose these delicate and very important conversations can happen in the school.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Again, my name is Cornelia Griggs. I am one of Peter's clinical partners at MGH, and I'm a pediatric surgeon. And I am also very involved in the Gun Violence Prevention Center, and I'm the director of a lot of our education initiatives. So Peter just quoted some really grave statistics, and I don't want to minimize the importance or the severity of those, but I do hopefully want to give you some information about what we're doing at MGH and in the Gun Violence Prevention Center that will, I hope, leave you guys with hope. Because I think one of the most powerful things that I experienced personally as a parent to young children after the shootings at Robb Elementary in Uvalde was sort of turning to my mother, who lives with us because my husband and I are both surgeons, and she makes sure that our children aren't orphans. She just said a very brief phrase, and she said, "And nothing will change." And I think that was a sentiment that was deeply held by a lot of us parents at the time of the shooting. And the effects of gun violence in schools, because of the news media, because of social media, is inescapable, no matter where you live, no matter how safe your neighborhood feels on a daily basis, and no matter how leafy and liberal your suburb may feel. That is not a protection from the effects of the crisis, the public health crisis that gun violence is in the United States. So what are we doing at MGH to make the transition from helplessness and hopelessness to feeling empowered? We started in 2019 at the very basic level, at the most simplest level where we could, in the hospital, training our residents how to talk to their patients about firearm safety in their homes and in their families. And this was really novel because, like Peter just said, we didn't have all the answers then, and we still don't have the answers now, but we just decided this is a conversation every physician, every healthcare provider should feel empowered to have with their patients in the clinics, in the emergency room, in the trauma bay, in the psych ward, and frankly, at their own dinner tables. And this was not taught or trained as part of the medical curriculum. And we just decided it was something that we had to teach and had to do. And now we have trained hundreds of residents, and it is part of our onboarding pathway for almost all of our new incoming residents. And that was a huge paradigm shift because that was before the NRA had tweeted physicians should stay in their lane. We had already claimed this lane at MGH, and there's a lot of power in that. And why is training residents relative, or why is it important to you guys as parents? Why are we talking about that in schools? Because the next natural extension of that work is how do we bring that curriculum that now we have tested and repeated and studied and verified and I don't want to say perfected, but improved over time. How do we bring that curriculum and that training and that feeling of empowerment and self-efficacy into schools? And so one of the projects I am leading is developing and modifying our curriculum for school nurses and school counselors. And one of the most powerful things that we can do this evening is have conversation and questions from you guys in the audience to understand what are the best questions to be asking. What are you seeing in your children at home? What are they asking you? Because our pie-in-the-sky dream is to have gun violence prevention baked into the health curriculum for all elementary students, and to have it be validated and verified and age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate. And we're a long way away from that now. But there are researchers in our center who are committed to getting there as quickly as possible. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're having this conversation, because when we started doing our trainings, we believed there was power in simply having the conversation. And as Peter mentioned, even an event like tonight, hosting this conversation in a school is a big change from where we were 10 years ago. And so we don't come here with the pretense that we have all the answers. And that doesn't mean we won't try to answer them. We want you to ask us hard questions because we want to know what you are wrestling with your children at the dinner table, at family holidays, talking to your relatives who live in other states that have very different laws than we have in Massachusetts. And that drives and informs our research, which is always first and foremost community informed. And community can mean very different things. We have really close allies and partners in Dorchester and Mattapan and Roxbury, but that doesn't mean that community engagement from suburbs like Needham is any less important, because we have to figure out what is the right way to get this kind of curriculum into schools and how to do it in a way that is trauma-informed, developed directly with child trauma-based psychiatrists who we have in our team at the center, so that we can understand what the impact of simply having those conversations is. How do we create conversation guides for parents? What should the first questions be in developing those conversation guides? That is all the kinds of research and work that we're doing in the Gun Violence Prevention Center. So the goal of our talk today is not to hammer you with grave statistics, although it's important to frame the conversation. It's so that everyone who came here tonight to engage in this conversation knows that you have a role in our work at the Gun Violence Prevention Center. And even if it's just asking us a really hard question tonight, or if it's sending us a follow-up email, there's so many different ways to get involved. And whatever your talent is, whatever your skill is, there's a way to harness that towards good and towards the effort that we have in the Gun Violence Prevention Center at MGH, whether it's contributing cookies to an event like this. We have arts-based initiatives. We have policy-based initiatives. We're doing heavy data research. You know, that's one of the really exciting things that makes this year different. For the first time in a really long time, we're seeing multiple government-sponsored funding mechanisms to look at the right way to attack, from a research paradigm, the gun violence crisis in America. A lot of things are changing, and there is a lot of reason for hope, and there are a multitude of ways to get involved, and we'd love to connect you to people in our center, our community partners, to get anyone who's interested in being more involved. Join our team.
I want to add one thing, actually. You can tell why she's the educator. I've always been dyslexic, and the only time I've been sitting with a superintendent was bad. But let me leave you with one thing about data, and I'm a data wonk, and I like data, and Cornelia likes data, and one of the consequences of this education program that we established at MGH just 4 or 5 years ago was a result of an observation by a student, by a resident, a pediatrics resident. She looked at the kids that were coming to our emergency department with suicidal or homicidal ideation only. 100 kids in 1 year, and 5 times was the question of access to lethal means asked. 95% of these kids went home without that question being asked. That's not good practice of medicine for us. In 1 year after training the first set of residents, it went up to 34%. So the results are there, and we have a lot of work to do. But Cornelia mentioned we trained a bunch of residents. We trained 700 residents and nurse practitioner students and psychiatrists and nurses, and we're going to extend this now to an avatar-based training system so that we can actually scale the program up and get it out and get everybody engaged in the teaching of people about how to have these conversations that are difficult.
That's proprietary.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Maciacos and Dr. Griggs. It's great to the second conversation we've had. It's great to learn from you. And you know, I will say, as superintendent in the Needham Public Schools, a couple things I'd want to share. The first thing, so that the community knows, when I talk to our principals and our teachers often the teachers more indirectly, but the principals directly, and with families, I tell them that my number one job and their number one priority is the health, safety, and wellness of our students. Now, you might think that it would be the curriculum, or our MCAS scores, or our graduation rate and what colleges our students are accepted to, all of which are important. But they fall far, far below that number one priority, the health and safety and wellness of our students and their security. And so, as a result, we have conversations like this. We engage the community, we engage the police to think about how we can be safe and secure. And of course, it's never a guarantee for safety or security, but it is a priority for me. And I'll tell you that that priority for me has been shaped because of three experiences I've had in my career. Gabriella was mentioning that many years ago, 40 years ago, I was an English teacher. I taught actually in South Central Los Angeles in Watts for 7 years. And one night, while I was in charge of a student dance, and those of you who have been to LA or maybe lived in LA, the schools there are kind of, a big part of the school is being outside. Hallways are generally outside. There might be a covering, but they're outside. A gym is a gym, but mostly students are gathered outside except for classrooms. We had a dance on a Saturday night. It was right after my oldest daughter was born, and my wife was home with her. And I was in charge with the security detail. Now, a security detail at our school, which is a 300-student school, a small high school, involves 7 LAPD officers. And because of the neighborhood we were in Watts on Central Avenue. We wouldn't allow this young man who was on a bicycle into the dance. He came all in red from head to toe. He was a member of the Bloods. Because he wasn't a student. He was actually a 7th grader. We wouldn't let him in. He kept circling back on his bicycle, and when I finally said to him no, he left one more time and came back with a .22 caliber Uzi and shot at us and hit 2 of the students I was standing next to. I dodged, and a weird thought in my mind, by the way, I had a brand new white crisp shirt on. And when I hit the ground, my first thought was, this is going to get dirty. The weird things you think about. The 2 students who were with me as the target, one was hit, and I remember going over to him, and this would not be best practices, picking a bullet out of his back because it was a surface wound, but it was there, and I flecked it out of his back. And we all went to the hospital. The dance carried on, and one of the things about LA, those of you who have been there or lived there, there's a constant drone in the air from helicopters, particularly in South Central LA. The LA Sheriff's County Police have helicopters circling. The drone is 24/7. And I remember that night when I came back from the hospital, and Kevin, the boy who was hit, he went home with his mom. He was released from the hospital, and thinking about the helicopters. And believe me, there were a lot of helicopters after the LAPD who were on site reported that officers fired on. There was a deluge of officers. But I remember the kids who were in the dance and who were coming out to these flashing lights, and we had to end the dance, and it was pretty chaotic. Just kind of carrying on. Oh, yeah, this is bad. When's the next dance? And I remember thinking finally that drone of the helicopter finally just got to me that night. And as a student said to me, Mr. G, you got to get over that. That's how we roll. In other words, this is our life. This is how we live. This is how we learn in this community. Fortunately, for many of those young men, it was an all-boys school, Catholic school. Most of them were successful and moved on with their lives. I'm still friendly with many of them. My oldest daughter, one of my students, is her godfather. But there's some who never made it. And I think if we had the resources that we have now, many of those students who did not make it would have made it. I tell you that story because I left as a teacher and became ultimately a principal. And when I left that school, I remember thinking, I've got to make sure that we think about how we can provide for these students who don't have the resources to take care of themselves when violence occurs. And then when I became principal at Shrewsbury High School in Massachusetts, I remember very clearly, right around lunchtime on April 20th, 1999, which was the day of the Columbine shooting. And I remember at that time, in that suburban school setting, the shock that started to go through. There wasn't the internet, they didn't have TikTok, they didn't have any of that, so the news traveled really slowly. But the shock in a suburban community for the horror that was going on thousands of miles away was palpable. And what can we do? How can we help? What needs to happen? And we did try to bring counselors to talk to kids, and it took days for families and students to process this. And we were thousands of miles away, but kids wrote notes, and they created a banner and they sent, and they actually connected with some students in Columbine. That lesson informed me that you have to meet kids where they are. They have to be able to have an opportunity to process events with adults who care for them, their parents first of all, but also teachers and counselors, and allow them to grieve, to talk about what happened. In this case, they created some artwork that they sent to Columbine, to the elementary students in Columbine. And now as superintendent, I recognize that you have to rally the community, you have to meet students where they are, you have to be able to provide resources for them, and then, of course, in December of 2012, we all heard about Sandy Hook. I taught in Brookfield, I was an assistant principal, in Brookfield, Connecticut, which is adjacent to Newtown. Newtown is Needham. It's the same community. It is no different. It's a little bit more rural, and it's the same community. Columbine and Jefferson County Public Schools is a little different. And Verbum Day High School, where I taught in South Central LA, is very different from the mean streets of Needham. But Newtown is Needham, but it's just in Connecticut. And at that time, when that occurred, Kate Fitzpatrick, the town manager, and I got together, and I said to her, we were thinking about this coincidentally together, we have to figure out a way to pull the schools in Needham together, the leaders, to talk about school safety and wellness and security. And since 2012, actually February of 2013, a couple of months later, Kate and I, twice a year, meet with leaders in the Needham Public Schools, the leaders of Walker School, Olin College, St. Seb's, and St. Joe's. And we meet with our public safety experts and officials, and we talk about how can we think about school safety. Not just bulletproofing buildings, but we talk about that and security systems, but also how are we going to deal with, in other words, it's not just the hardware that we think about, it's also the software of our students' heads and hearts. And what can we do? How do we need to support them? How do we need to identify kids who are troubled? And what do we do when something happens? I'm proud that as superintendent, Kate and I, and with Kate's leadership, which is amazing, we've been able to do that all of these years, for 10 years, and we're going to continue to do it because the safety of our students and their well-being is job one. We do the work imperfectly. We have a lot to learn. I'm excited to learn from my colleagues here to my right and from the Deputy Chief and from all of you. We'll continue to learn so that we can continue to prioritize safety for our students.
Thanks, Dan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the other panelists. I'm here to talk about the ways in which we try to prevent gun violence. There's really four main ways that we can act and make sure that we're responsible. That's through firearms licensing, mental health support and identification, enforcement of gun laws, as well as training in the schools. Massachusetts has model gun laws. They're very strict. Gun owners have to pass a certified firearm safety class. The chief can deny for non-suitability. which is something rare you don't find in a lot of other states. They have to reapply every 5 years with an additional background check, which includes a criminal background check and a check with the Department of Mental Health to see if there's been any mental health holds on the individual that's applying for the firearms license. The chief and the department, myself, we take firearms licensing very seriously. There have been many situations where as soon as we're aware that somebody is potentially unqualified to carry a firearm or own firearms, we take action on their license. The chief's name is printed on everybody's license, so we take it very seriously. Mental illness response training for individuals. We currently have 27 officers that have been trained in crisis intervention. That's a 40-hour class. They're not guidance counselors and they're not psychiatrists or psychologists, but it's excellent training. It involves de-escalation. It involves providing resources and the importance of getting these people help. We work closely, our SROs work closely with the schools to make sure that they're identifying kids that are in need of mental health services. We have a clinician that works 20 hours a week in our department or more, if necessary, to follow up with our crisis intervention trained officers to make sure that people that have been involved in mental health crisis are receiving adequate treatment. And it's more of a way to interact with those people when they're not in a crisis. It's a lot more successful, and we have a lot lower recidivism with those people. In other words, we have less repeat dealings with them. On that topic, in the news recently, you've probably seen or heard a lot about red flag laws on the topic of mental health. Prior to that, like I said, we have, since I've been doing firearms licensing and before, we've always been able to, it's required that we run a check through DMH, like I said, to find out if the person has any mental health holds. Red flag laws take that a little bit further. Parents or loved ones can petition to have somebody's license taken away. It's extreme ERPO, extreme risk prevention orders. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it. It wasn't a police-initiated thing, I don't think, but we can assist people with it if it's something that's necessary. We have no problem doing that. Domestic violence is a huge thing. I think I have a statistics here that I can bring up later if anyone has a question on it, but making sure that suspects or victims of domestic violence are not in a situation where there's guns in the home is very important in Massachusetts. If you have an active restraining order, you cannot have a license to carry or an FID. So that is a big thing as well. Enforcement. So, like I said, if we find out about somebody violating a law while they have a firearms license, we can take action on it immediately. Oftentimes that comes with some storage violations that we find out about. Somebody's in another town, perhaps. They get pulled over, there's an OUI, and they have guns in the car, and guns and alcohol don't mix. So that department notifies us, and we take action. The same thing would happen if someone from out of town was in our town, and they were violating some laws that made them potentially disqualified. We would notify the other police department to make sure that action was taken. I have a story about storage, and it relates to the two doctors kind of talking about teaching your kids. One time, I can remember, this happening. People knew that, a lot of people knew that I was a police officer that were my children's parents, friends' parents. And on one occasion in my career, I had someone said, "Oh, you're a police officer." And she actually happened to grow up in Needham. I knew her from Needham. She said, "Yeah." She said, do you mind if I ask you a question? I said, "No, sure, go ahead." She said, "Do you have any guns in the home?" And I don't, but I remember kind of thinking, that's a really powerful question to ask somebody. It can be that simple, like, do you have guns in the home? Are they secure? I would hope that most people, if they felt that strongly about it, would be willing to ask somebody that question. And as far as training, I think a lot of people know about the training we do. We try and put a lot of it on social media. We train on a regular basis in active shooter situations. We do not, when we train, we do not use students when we're running around with simunitions, and which aren't real simunitions. They're not real guns. We do not have children present for that. And we have recently been cross-training with Needham Fire, so that we're putting rescue teams together as well. So not only are we addressing the threat, but we're forming teams with the fire to go in and rescue students. It just happens to be students, but it could be any active shooter situation, whether it's in a school or some other building. We do ALICE drills. We coordinate with the schools. Our SROs are both trained in that. We work with the schools, and we have pre-plans in case of active shooter events. So we keep plans of the schools, building plans, and try and have some sort of tactical response based on every school. It's important to pre-plan for anything you do, because when it happens, if you don't have a plan, you're going to hesitate. And we also worked with the town of Needham to teach the program of from the Department of Justice, Run, Hide, Fight. And we've done that with a few of the public buildings that are the town of Needham's. But I think it seems like the driving force, perhaps, or one of the goals, and I think it's an excellent goal, is just something as simple as what I said. Do you have a firearms license? Do you have any guns in the home? Storage is very important. Making sure that guns are stored properly is very important. We have gun locks at the station that anyone who needs to be able to secure a firearm, they can do that. There's safes. We can talk to people if they have questions about gun storage, absolutely. But thank you for your time.
Okay, is this on? Sorry. You can't hear me, I'll use my teacher voice. Is that something? Thank you so much to all the panelists. And we'll start, I feel like turn it off. And we'll start taking questions. If folks want to come to the microphone and ask questions, or if you have written on your cards, if anybody wants to start, I think, this was I got to say, we did a prep meeting before, but all of you saved, your stories for tonight. So thank you for sharing these very important stories with us. So anybody wants to come to the microphone before we start sorting through the cards? Yes, we have one. All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk tonight. My name is Nikki McManus. I have 2 kids in elementary school. One question I have is, you ask about our feedback about what are kids saying, and my kids are relatively young. But of course, where they see guns is, call it laser tag at home, video games, and obviously like TV movie. So I wonder, do you have any advice, or what have you seen in terms of how to manage that, what sort of conversation to have with your kids? Maybe others do too.
Yes.
For anybody.
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things that will inform the answer is the age of the children, because what we see in the hospital with the youngest children who come in with gunshot wounds or firearm injuries is that they've mistaken a real firearm for a toy. And so I think for children who are at the, third, second, first, kindergarten level, the most important conversation to have in the home is distinguishing between what's a toy and what's not a toy. And I don't think there is an age that is too young to begin having conversations about firearm safety, because there are some toy guns that look disturbingly similar to real firearms. And so I think the more we can normalize having those conversations as early as possible, that you could mistake this for a gun, and if you see it, don't touch it, right? And that there needs to be an adult nearby. And as the deputy chief has talked to us about, every adult in Massachusetts who owns a firearm goes through safety training about how to properly store the gun. And then I think that goes back to the importance of the conversation, normalizing the conversation when your children go to another home of asking about firearms, because it can feel super awkward. I've done it, and the first few times I did it, and my kids are young, so they don't go on that many play dates where I'm not there, but I'm just beginning to enter that phase of parenthood, and I'm not gonna lie, it felt strange the first time I did it. But the more we normalize it, and the more people are doing it, the more it becomes the default, right? Just like there was a time where people didn't wear seatbelts in their car, and now not strapping your child into a car seat if they're at an age where they're in a car seat feels really wrong. So I think that applies to having those conversations at home with your children, telling them that guns are not a toy, because that's what we see most commonly in the youngest age groups.
One other aspect of what we're doing is we're trying to redefine or transform the narrative of that conversation or the observation of what your kids are seeing on television, right? I grew up in the time of Wile E. Coyote, and Wile E. Coyote never died, right? The superheroes never died. So jumping off a garage with a cape on was ending up in a hospital being taken care of by trauma surgeons, right? So next week, so we have partnered with Emerson College, which is a media arts college in Boston. And we signed a contract with them for 3 years, and they're producing 3 classes a semester. Last semester, they did a video arts class, so they produced a documentary about the voices of gun violence. They did 2 theater productions about gun violence. They're doing a VR and gaming class this year about gun violence. And the kids that are in the class, the students that are in the class, are being partnered with community members now. And the community's coming into the class, and they're acting as teachers so that they can understand better what it means to have the lights and sirens going off in Watts in the middle of the night. Next week, I go to Hollywood, and I'm meeting one of the producers to see about getting that to Hollywood, so that when they produce the videos and the media, it's a little bit better informed. It's not glamorized, maybe. But I think the idea here is that everybody's talking now. And as Cornelia said, if you don't have the conversation, it's a conversation of a missed opportunity. I used to tell my kids not to go into the master bedrooms of their play dates, because that's where the guns were typically kept when they were the age that Cornelia's kids are. And there's data that suggests that most of the guns that are kept unsecured are at the bedside nightstand, and the chief can probably corroborate that if you can understand the consequences of that. Now, asking the question of a gun owner is also important, really. If I ask the gun owner in the United States, do you secure your guns? The answer will be yes, right? So we have to better be able to ask the question about safety and storage and getting those conversations at the medical side of things too.
Thank you.
Can I just comment about this issue? So I work with very young children and have children of my own. Sorry.
Oh, please.
kids. Hi, my name is Krista. I work for Needham Public Schools. But I just want to point out that for all of you who are under such peer pressure to have all of the movies and all of the video games and all of the stuff that all of their peers are doing, I really encourage you to follow your heart and resist that. My kids never had Fortnite. My kids didn't have Xbox and PlayStation. They played it at their friends' houses, but we also had conversations about we don't play with weapons. And you know, when they would want to shoot something, I'd say, okay, let's turn that into whatever, a hose, a camera, all different things. And of course, you know, my kids were, the kids I teach are very young, so it's easy for me to just redirect that. But it's also something that my kids knew it just wasn't allowed in my house. And yes, they played it at friends' houses and things like that, but they also knew that it wasn't that okay, and it wasn't that normal, and it wasn't just a part of life to be shooting police officers all the time on a video screen, that kind of stuff. So even though it's pervasive, it can be done. And I don't mean to be holier than thou, like that, you know, if I can do it, everybody can do it. I understand the struggle, and I know it's not right for everybody, and I'm not saying video games are evil, but parenting is paramount in that whole process, and you can allow it, but you can also have the conversations around it, and you can monitor what they're doing and the amount of time that they get sucked into it and that they get obsessed with it. And it's really hard, but it can be done. So I just...
So not to minimize that, and I totally appreciate what you're saying, this is not the problem in the rest of the world, right? So parenting is absolutely important, and the opportunity to talk about this in your home, how you want to talk about it in your home, is very important, and I do that in my home too. But I'm a trauma surgeon, and I see the consequences of kids doing impulsive things. I talk to mothers about the death of their kids, unexpected deaths of their kids. And no matter what you say to them in the home, they're still going to try things, right, outside of the home. So that's where we're coming from. A superintendent, a police officer, surgeons, talking about this conversation that has to become cultural, right? Mothers Against Drunk Driving changed culture. My 18-year-old went to a prom, superintendent, close your ears. I knew he was going to drink, right? But they addressed it by having 2 proms on separate nights, so the kids on the other day were driving the kids that were at the prom the night before. Now, they said it wasn't about drinking, right? But the consequences of driving while intoxicated for my age group, my 18-year-old, is very different than what I did when I was 18 years old. And that's to the credit of the mothers that came out and started talking about it. And it happened in the house, and we talk about restraining, putting a kid in a car seat. I used to deliver my kid's car seat to his play date, so if the parent took the kid out on a play date, he would have a car seat. And so, again, it's normalizing the conversation in the home the way you want to have it in your home, but ideally, we have to understand that what you do in the house isn't necessarily translatable about what they're going to do in the neighbor's house. And I see it, unfortunately, and more talking, more nights like this is very, very important to have this change.
And I think the intersection of that comment and our first question and exactly what Peter said is we're all saying that what our kids are living through right now is not normal. I cannot accept that bulletproof backpacks and militarizing our schools and having to go through multiple containment, active shooter, lockdown drills per year, per semester. I cannot accept as a parent that this is where we are and that it's only going to get worse. And it's not normal. This is a crisis. And the more activated we are as a community in having these conversations, in engaging with our neighbors, engaging with the parents of our children's friends, the more we can begin to shift the narrative, to shift policy, and to change at the most basic level the way we talk about guns in the community, and not from a sense of powerlessness, right? But from a sense of agency.
Question from the audience? Yes. I know you.
Yes, my partner. I think there's even two questions buried in this, and I know that's not fair, but I'll do it regardless. So I can't help, like, through this panel, for some reason, I see a cloud over all of you that connects all of you, which is like mental health, right? And I feel pretty strongly that we're doing like a pretty poor job addressing that, especially in our youth, even in our nice town here, based on what the experiences of the friends I have. And so there's one thing that Dr. Maciacos said that like terrifies me, that is different from how I've understood suicide and gun violence, is that it can be a bit impulsive. And I've never understood that to be the case. And so part of the question is like, how important is mental health? And then, but then the other part, I'm still gonna, even if you tell me it's not important, I'm gonna say it's important. And I'm gonna wonder from our institutions of law enforcement and schools, like, I'm not interested in further stigmatizing people who are already feeling pretty poor and ill. But like, are we getting better at seeing it when it's happening? And are we taking that into account into how, be it mental health or be it trauma, and however this ACEs framework works, of like knowing people with a high propensity to do stuff to themselves or others, like, are we getting better at seeing it? And are there ways that we can, that we're addressing it, that without stigmatizing it further, that are helping sort of move us along?
I think the short answer is yes, we are getting better at it. I think, you know, in Needham in particular, I'm glad Representative Garlick is here. Just before I came to Needham, tragically, there were a series of suicides. I don't believe any one of them was attributed to a gun, but I could be wrong. And Denise and several of town colleagues and school folks got together and created the Suicide Prevention Coalition in Needham. And that established a framework and really propelled in the schools discussions about mental health, counseling, social and emotional learning, which has become a big part that we join at the hip with academics to talk to kids and to have students, you know, prepare for the day when they meet in community, for example, at an elementary and a second grade classroom, when they meet and they greet and they talk about the day and each other and the work ahead and things that they may need to discuss. That's a way to set up the day. And then they're supported by counselors. They're supported by others in the community. We're strong partners with Riverside Community Care. And with the police department, which more recently is, and the deputy chief can talk about this, as a someone on board part-time who's working around mental health issues. I don't think that our students or families look at mental health issues or emotional struggles as something that's a deficit. I think I think our families understand now that it is something that we have to be honest about, that we can, just as we do with our physical health, we can struggle with our mental health at times, and we can have a conversation about it. And so I think that has resulted in the schools in us having more open conversations and to be able to identify students who might be at risk or who might have a need for something. We do it imperfectly, and of course there are no guarantees about anything, but I do think it's a big part of what this community believes, pulling Needham Youth Services together with the schools, which we do, the Needham Public Health Department, the Needham Police and our school resource officers. This community approach is really the way I think we're going to tackle, and certainly with our medical professionals, tackle this issue. So I see that happening, at least from the school perspective.
I will say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
From our perspective, we have not only provided training to help identify people in crisis better or people that need support, But quite frankly, we address and respond to mental health related crises and calls a lot better than we did when I first came on. Everyone understands that it's just somebody having a crisis. We don't know why, but they're treated a lot more respectfully. I'll just quickly tell you a story, or how it used to be when I came on. We would get a call, we would go, somebody would be having a mental health crisis. We would call the police department would respond, the fire department would respond. We would take them to Newton Wellesley Hospital. Police officers can sign a pink sheet of voluntary committal, or I'm sorry, an involuntary committal. One of our officers or a sergeant would sign that. They would be left with the hospital, and I've had a circumstance where I was driving around later that evening and saw the person walking down the street about 2.5, 3 hours later. One of the problems was that by the time we had them all calm, got them in the ambulance, brought them to the hospital, by the time they got to be evaluated, they were no longer in crisis. So one thing we do with that in that situation is we make sure that the doctor that is doing the evaluation has at least a copy of the report and what our officers noticed. We also, with our Riverside clinician, our part-time Riverside clinician, she can do evaluations in the home. And that, when that works out, that's great. It's not always possible, but if the person is not violent, it's certainly a better place to do an evaluation, not only because they're not going to the hospital and tying up resources there or tying up our officers, but because they're in the moment of what's going on, and it's really the best time to evaluate them. But to answer your question, I think over my 26 years, not only are we able to identify people and get them support, but we're responding a lot better than we did. And moreover, to Dr. Gutekan's point, as a community, we have a crisis intervention team. We work with the public schools. We work with the Needham Youth Commission, or I apologize, I'm not sure what it's called. I can't think off the top of my head. We work with public health. We work with the fire department. We all meet monthly to talk about different problems, and we come up with out-of-the-box solutions to try and deal with people that are tying up resources amongst all of the departments. And then we go to a much larger population. We meet with, we invite Newton Wellesley Hospital, we invite BI Needham, we invite representatives of the Walker School, and then we do that quarterly, and we bring everyone in. We find out what people are seeing, what are the trends, how can the police department assist you, how can you guys assist the police department. Riverside representatives are there as well, and it's really successful. It's a great way to make sure that we're not missing something or letting somebody slip through. So.
And I will add to that. I mean, we are getting better at identifying crisis, but what I'm going to get back to is the idea of preventing the crisis in the first place, right? You can't. Most of the deaths that happen or injuries that happen with firearms in the country are not associated with mental illness, and so many of the kids that we see have no mental illness diagnosis in their medical records. So that's one thing that we have to consider. Crisis is important to understand, and we're hoping to teach that. But as I said earlier, 5% of the 100 kids that were brought to our hospital with a diagnosis of suicidal or homicidal ideation were not asked the question of gun access. So getting back to the vehicle, I think having these conversations, facilitating these conversations is more preventable, has a more preventable outcome, I think.
If you have a question, just come to the microphone. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It's really fair that I have to go after you, Alex. I'm not going to try to lower it. I'll try. Okay. I'm not sure who this question should go to, so anyone of you feel free to answer. I'm a Needham parent. I have a 7th grader and a 3rd grader. And I wanted to ask a question about ALICE drills. I guess it's 2-part. The first part is whether or not there's data, particularly surrounding the efficacy of ALICE drills or any negative impacts that it might have on children. And then whether or not there are alternatives to ALICE drills that are being researched or, experimented with across the country.
So ALICE, which stands for Alert, Lockdown, Inform, Counter, and Evacuate, is a term that was really more popular, I think, 9 or 10 years ago. And that's the protocol we use. We don't really call it an ALICE drill anymore. We're trying to, police and schools call it an armed intruder drill. And we do have them. Just as we have fire drills. We're required by law to have 3 fire drills a year. And we prepare students, particularly our youngest and some of our more vulnerable students, for those fire drills because we know when they're happening. And we prepare them to let them know what it's going to sound like and what they're going to do and where they have to go. I see the armed intruder drills in a very similar way, unfortunately. And it was not a feature of what I did when I was early on in my career as a teacher or an assistant principal, but after Columbine, we adopted some different strategies. We constantly look at what we're doing, how we're doing it in partnership with the police. We make adjustments. I mentioned this group of schools in Needham that the town manager and I coordinate. I neglected to mention its name. It's not a very complicated name, the Needham Schools Emergency Advisory Team. We meet twice a year, or NSEAT. And when we get together, we talk about the efficacy of the drills and how are they working. I want to emphasize something, though, about the armed intruder drills. These drills are not with guns, police, lights. There's not that drama. It is more based on what's going on in the classroom, and quite frankly, we have a curriculum that goes with it. We work with our school resource officers and teachers. We actually have that curriculum posted on the website somewhere. And it's really more the teacher talking to his or her students about if someone is trying to endanger us, what are we going to do? It's having that conversation. Needham has for many years had a child abuse prevention program, stranger danger. We've done the same thing in our schools. So we do the armed intruder drills. They are low-key. I think they're low-key but high stakes and important to do. At least one a year, perhaps 2, but 1 a year, and again, three fire drills a year. So we have them. We are continuing to look at the efficacy of them and what's working and what's not working.
We are also looking at the efficacy of them from the mental health side of things, as your question implies. There are no data available yet about what they do to the child. There is, again, from the prevention side of things, for me, there's 2 things that we need to look at. One is exactly what the superintendent says. We have to be prepared, right? There has to be some kind of systematic review of what our resources are, how we're going to react to a situation where a child is in danger. There's no question about it. But what is too much and what is too little is something that we're going to look at. And there are survey tools that we're going to be able to engage in, and we're going to be interviewing teachers. We're going to be interviewing some of the older kids that have gone through them. They're now in college. And so we can access that information to see how that has evolved over time. So again, it's one of those unknowns, but not falling far from what the superintendent says. You do a fire drill so that you can get everybody out of the building. You hope that everybody gets out of the building when the fire comes. Same thing has to happen from the standpoint of prevention in some degree. We don't know what too much is yet.
Hi, my name is Megan White. This is, I think, a perfect follow-up question, a little story. I have a kindergartner, so I'm new to all this, and I was sitting with a bunch of neighbors, and they all have 5th grade, 3rd grade and stuff. And after Texas, I was asking them genuinely, how do you talk about this with your kids? And it was literally crickets, just silence. And no one talked about these drills. And I was specifically talking about the drills. So how do you talk about the drills, but how do you talk about the shootings with your kids? So my question is, what do you tell parents with these drills? What should we be telling our kids at different ages? And do we get that information? And then a second question is, how do we not normalize this? Like you said, like how do we not this doesn't become normal for our children on a Needham level, on a Massachusetts level, and then on a national level? So I'm interested in that.
If I can take a stab at this first, I think one of the things that we have to understand is that no drills are the same. No two drills are the same. What happens here is not what's happening in Sudbury and not what's happening in Wayland, and it's not what's happening in other schools. There's a mandate that these should happen, but they're not happening the same way. And we can actually, I think the conversation that you should have is with the people that are making these drills so that you understand what they are first, because I bet you don't know what happens, right? So I think one of the things that empowers people and how to talk to their kids about things is knowing exactly what their kids are going through, right? So I think that might be a good opportunity for the school districts to say, okay, maybe the parents should actually know what's going on and how it's being done. You might be put at ease. It might make you understand that what they're doing is actually a good safety drill for the kid. And you have a conversation about what did you experience, right? Or what are you going to anticipate experiencing? So I think that's one thing. How do you not normalize it? I think that's our job for the next 5 years. I'm not going to quit until I figure it out. I'll tell you that one of the things that the state legislature has done over the last 10 years in Speaker DeLeo's tenure is he really focused on mental illness and mental health and early learning and early coping skills. And they put a lot of money into that aspect of education over the last 5 years, which I think is imperatively important, totally underfunded, very important to fund. Representative Garlick, are you hearing me? I think what you've done over the last 5 years, 10 years about funding early education and getting kids engaged is a very important concept, and I think that extends to the family.
And that question is exactly what drove us to start our pilot project with school nurses, school counselors, and teachers. We want to talk to the people who are in the building when these drills are happening, who are seeing the kids before and after, to get a better sense from the people who are living through this and the people who are doing this every day in different school districts, to understand and have them tell us how to study this and how to understand it and how to use that data to then drive policy, because we don't have perfect answers to those questions. And I don't have a perfect conversation guide for parents, but we're starting with people who are in the building while it's happening.
I do appreciate that MGH and the center are thinking about a way to assess the efficacy of this, because that'll be a great tool for schools to use. And yes, we do, we preview by alerting families that there will be a drill. And as I said, we have posted the curriculum online. I'll try to figure out a way to make sure we highlight that again, what we share with elementary students and middle school students, so that parents can have a sense of what this conversation looks like.
It would be really good to know how many kids don't come to school those days? Just that.
Yep. Yep.
So my name's Elisa Rosen, and I'm following up exactly on those two questions and what you just said, Dr. Maciacos, which is you mentioned that one of your kids doesn't go to school on the days. And I'm going to say, probably like many people, this is a really upsetting topic. And I have a fourth grader who's new to the Needham Public Schools. And I don't know, and I don't think she knows a lot about gun violence. And it breaks my heart to think about having to tell her why we're running these drills. And I'm just sort of curious about how you break it to your kids that this stuff happens, and how do you feel about the fact that your child doesn't go on the days of the drills?
I feel sad that he doesn't go to school on the day of the drills. It's one a year. He's a sensitive kid. He's always been that way. But we have a talk about it the night before and the day of, just to assure him that what's going on is not something that's designed to hurt him. It's something to protect him. And he chooses not to go, and I choose not to send him. You know, I sign an absentee form, or I call in, and it's sad that we have to do this, right? And we have to even think about whether this is the right thing to do. And I may be doing it wrong, but I think that's what I'm open to understanding in the next couple of years. And if I'm doing it wrong, if I'm doing him a disservice by saying, no, you can stay home today, or find a better way to do this. It's a choice that we made. It may be a bad choice for him. But I think that's the thing about this topic. There is no real bad choice here about how you're going to talk to your kid as long as you talk to them about it. And I make a point of talking to him about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just, honestly,
It's confusing.
I don't know how much my daughter knows about it, and I
Yeah.
don't feel like telling her that people go into schools and kill children. And it just makes me so upset.
My son turned off the Muppets when Kermit had a Russian accent. He's that sensitive. So, you know, I think these are the conversations we have to have. I mean, you have a panel here that's coming blind from this a little bit, right, into this discussion. We don't know all of the answers, and we're trying to get to the point where everybody is comfortable enough to talk about it.
Appreciate your
Yeah.
Okay, many thanks for the very good presentations. My name is Matti Goldberg. We're new in Needham, and we're also quite new in this country. So yeah, it's a lot of information for me to digest. I was just wondering, actually, the previous two speakers already, they kind of ask more or less the question that I was about to ask, and in relation to not just the mental health of potential risk factors, but also the mental health of the children, because I guess my hunch is that the kids, they do feel that, okay, there is a threat of some kind, and probably in the long run that does have an implications on their mental health. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about what sort of research is happening on that side of things. You mentioned these surveys, you mentioned that the data is a bit limited, but how are we beginning to understand that part? And then in connection to that, because I think that's the area where parents can do something. I mean, parents have limited influence about everything that happens in society, but that part is something where we can support our children. So you mentioned ways of how we should talk to our children about this, but today when I was leaving for this event, my son asked me, "Dad, where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to listen to a discussion." And he asked me, like, "So what are they going to talk about?" And I didn't really know what to say. So this is kind of a similar problem that the previous speakers also had. Yeah, so it would be great if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Thanks.
I think Dr. Griggs talked about that in the sense of how you talk to your kids about drinking and driving and sex and drugs and the things that we were uncomfortable talking about when I was a kid, talking to my dad, who said, "Don't worry about it. Sex doesn't matter," right? But I think these are the conversations that I had with my patients when HIV became a problem in the early 80s and 90s, right, when I was training. And there was this stigma associated with it. And we didn't talk about it. And we didn't mention HIV. And we didn't mention AIDS. And we didn't mention LGBTQ exposure to risk. And now it's become commonplace in our clinic. Just to pose it a little bit differently, we do not ask the questions in the clinic. How do we expect you to know how to ask them at home, right? So that's what we're studying. We're trying to figure out how to ask the questions. We had a small session last week with a group from Concord, Carlisle, Wayland. There's a health consortium, and the health commissioner for Carlisle said she was asked about guns in the PCP's office, all right? That's where the conversation starts. If we're going to help you normalize the conversation with your kids, we have to start normalizing the conversation with you and the pediatricians doing the same. There are no studies going on about the effect of mental health about these topics. That's where we're trying to figure it out with the nurses and the educators.
Yeah, in terms of the data, I mean, what we have is 1 or 2 steps removed. I mean, we have at the national CDC level, the youth-based risk assessment survey that gives us signals about how does obesity relate to violence? How does bullying relate to violence? How do sexually transmitted infections relate to violence risk? This is all uncharted territory in a lot of ways, and for so many years, these avenues of research were catastrophically underfunded. A lot has changed as recently as the past year or 2 years that has opened up the window for this avenue of research, and you would be terrified to know how little we know. But we were pioneers in this field before people even agreed that doctors should be studying gun violence. And there are people who still come to us with that question. Isn't this a legal issue? Isn't this a politics issue? Why are you doing this in a hospital? So that was 5 years ago, right? This is really new and it's really novel, and it's inspiring for me to hear parents saying like, well, why don't you have this data already? Why don't you have all the answers for me, right? Nobody was funding this. Nobody was supporting doctors or researchers or PhDs or scientists to do this.
And we just that when we looked at, just published a paper where we looked at all of the public health surveys that are out there now. And for youth, there are no questions about guns, or very few questions about guns coming from the CDC and NIH. So we have an avenue to the CDC, we have an avenue to NIH, and we're trying to get those questions back into the survey tools. That's where we're stuck, right? That's where we're trying to work through. Hopefully in a few years we'll have more answers for you. I'm sorry we don't have them now.
The one thing I would say, you were asking about how you were responding to your son. I think all of us as parents know this. I have 3 daughters, and the one fundamental thing I've learned about kids, regardless of their age, they want honesty from us. Even if it's an awful truth, they want to know, they want us to be honest and candid with them, because that leads to trusting us. And sometimes you can say to depending, you know your children, and developmentally it's important to understand that too. What you tell a 2nd grader about where you're going tonight, I'm going to a meeting to learn how to make sure that you're safe in school, is a good answer. But to a 8th grader, I'm going to a gun violence prevention meeting. And that would probably be possibly be met by a shoulder shrug and back to homework or back to texting. But that moment also signals Mom is telling me the truth, so that when something happens, I know that I can believe Mom or my teachers and trust them. So I want us also to give kids credit, because when we're honest with them, they're resilient. They have inside. They have a deep well, and that can help engender trust. It's when we obfuscate or we make up or we dodge that then they become anxious and wary and uncertain, and that never ends up well.
And it also tells them that their grown-up cares enough about this to skip dinner or bedtime or whatever it was, to have this conversation, and to know that the conversation is happening in their school. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone at that meeting who's trying to make a difference. And that's huge. That's huge for our kids to know.
Just because of a time thing, we have folks in line, so we do want to listen to the 3 questions of folks who have been standing. So please just come and state your questions. Now we're going to have to wrap up, but folks will be here to continue talking about it. But we want to listen to the 3 questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Pardon my stage fright. I was going to joke that I have somebody here in Needham in the Bard Meadow School, but actually she teaches first grade down the hall. And 10 years ago, I happened to come see her in the middle of the day, not really connecting it at the time that it was December 15th, and the day after Sandy Hook. And she had her 20 first graders lined up in the hallway, and that left a mark. So in that time, since then, I spent a lot of time learning about the subject, and I'm interested in the educational side of this. I think what you're doing from a remedial, from learning the consequences of gun violence is really important, but there's a growing sentiment, I think, in the country that doesn't want to pay much attention to how we got here. I think what the police are doing with licensing and making sure that the wrong people don't get guns is exactly what we should be doing. Most states don't do that, and by most I mean like 45 or something like that. I don't know what the number is. But the state of Massachusetts laws enable us to have the lowest gun death rate in the country, or sometimes Rhode Island or Hawaii. But there's a growing sentiment against those kinds of laws, and to overturn laws like the one in New York recently that was overturned by the Supreme Court. So my question is, what are we doing to teach the kids, and I don't mean the first graders, but the older kids especially who are about to become eligible to vote, what our history is about, what the Second Amendment was about, how did we get here, that the Second Amendment wasn't written so that we could overthrow the government violently if we don't like what they do and just shoot them. And there's all these silly ideas that are out there that are frankly wrong. And there's a lot of history, a lot of sociology, and a lot of legal side to it, if you will. A lot of it political. But the question is, rather long-winded, is would the town or the state consider more formal programs about gun violence end to end, including the historical side of it, the Constitution, the history, and the fact that there's nothing wrong with the way we regulate guns here, because it makes our gun death rate a tiny fraction of the states that don't have it. You know, Louisiana has a gun death rate 7 times higher than ours, and Alabama and Alaska and several others. Are we teaching them not just the consequences of the violence itself, but how we got there and how we ought to deal with it as it's coming under threat from people who frankly just aren't very educated on the subject? And that's my point of view, but that's because I spent 10 years learning about it.
Well, I guess I would just say that we do teach the U.S. Constitution in middle school and in high school, and so students do have an opportunity to discuss and understand what the Bill of Rights are and their responsibilities. I would not say that we do not have a gun curriculum or a gun prevention curriculum, but we do have that conversation about what it means to be a responsible citizen and what is in the Constitution.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't expect it to be an hour every day for the whole school year or something, but I think especially the kids who are going to be voting when they get out of here, not here, but when they get out of high school. It's a little late for this year, but I think having them understand the context and the history and the fact that there's an enormous amount of disinformation about our gun laws and about the consequences of guns and how we look compared to the rest of the world. And that's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jay Carter. Some of you in the room may know me. I have a 2nd and a 4th grader at Mitchell. And I think I may not really have a question, but I sort of want to challenge how people in this room think about the issue of guns, and I think I bring a unique perspective. As someone who grew up around firearms, not here in Texas, and have practiced as a criminal defense attorney in the Commonwealth for the last 15 years and have literally litigated hundreds of illegal firearm possession cases in my career, I absolutely agree that firearms and gun violence is a public health crisis in this country. And as an 8th grader, I lost a dear friend who stuck his father's .30-06 in his mouth and pulled the trigger. And so I understand that that is a serious problem. However, I don't think that we're solving the problems when we, in this part of the country, where we pat ourselves on the back for our great firearm laws, because what they've mostly accomplished is putting black and brown men in prison. Disproportionately, because those people owning a firearm may be an issue of survival for the communities that they live in. I'll ask the assistant chief here, how many illegal possession of firearm cases have been prosecuted in Needham in the last 10 years?
Not many.
10A violations, right? How many in 10 years? Probably less than I have in a year.
Yeah.
So can I interject? I think one of the things that we do, I hear what you're saying about the disproportionate incarceration. And two of our community partners in the Emerson project that we have are the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute. Clementina Sherry's son, Louis, was killed in '93 going to a peace meeting. And she formed an institute where she's helping survivors deal with the consequences of loss of their children, because Tina left the hospital with nothing. No son, no burial plan, no social services. And the consequences of recidivism in those neighborhoods are becoming apparent to us as we learn from them and bring them into the classroom and have them as teachers.
I get that, but I think if we're going to address this issue of gun violence as a country and as a Commonwealth, it's primarily an economic and a poverty issue.
Well, that's what I'm trying.
That's
what we're trying to say. That's where we are. The classroom is where the teaching is happening. The understanding and the raising of the voices of people most affected by it, as you're saying, has been dismissed. They're not being heard. And what we're doing in part is getting them to come to the table and teaching we started this a year and a half ago. And there were 3 community partners, three mothers who came to the classroom, and they sat in the corner of the class, and they listened for about 3 weeks as the students of the class were coming up with the ideas of what they were going to do with the documentary that they were going to make. And at the end, they were producing the class work with the students, and now we're funding them to be teachers, educators in the classroom, in the place where people are going to be writing the stories and telling the stories and putting the stories on television. It's the first time anybody's done this in this country. And so I totally hear your sensitivities about the fact that we're dismissing the population that's most impacted by it. But when I started the conversation, I said, everybody pats Massachusetts we're patting ourselves on the back.
We shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back for these laws.
Just hear me out for a second. 40 deaths a year, 450 gunshot wounds a year, 2,000 911 calls for shots fired is not the same Boston for some parts of Boston than we experience.
Right, and I agree it should be really hard to own a gun. My problem is that we incarcerate an 18-year-old for a mandatory minimum of 18 months.
Totally
understand. With a gun, right?
Totally understand.
Okay, that's the issue.
But
and there's nobody speaking up saying those laws
so
are.
go to the Transform Narratives of Gun Violence website. Anna Porter, who's taken the class, is in the audience. We'll give you the website. You go to that website and you see what we've done over the last 2 years, and maybe you'll understand that we're not just here for Needham and the suburbs.
And that is where the research at the Gun Violence Prevention Center started. We started from the premise that this cannot be physicians and researchers in the ivory tower coming up with policies and interventions and ideas in these communities, that all of the work that we do is centering the voices of people in the community who are most infected, and that is Black and brown voices. We don't hold a single event, panel in the Gun Violence Prevention Center where their voices aren't centered. And that the bulk of our research and all of the data that we have generated so far has been centering those voices, because we know and we see and we're hearing from the people in those communities that that is a huge crisis as well. So I think everything that you've said is completely spot on. What you've heard tonight was centered around a conversation about schools, because that's where we are. We're in a school. But it's only a tiny fraction of the work that we're doing.
But I appreciate the work that you're doing. I think I'm glad we're having this conversation. And for people who don't have the experience that I had growing up with, anybody who's has parents who have kids who are friends of mine, I don't own guns, but I grew up around them, and I was taught from a very young age, and I think it's something that parents shouldn't be afraid to talk about to their kids. Tell them they are tools and not toys. They are tools and not toys. And just like you wouldn't let your 5-year-old go touch your chainsaw in your shed, they shouldn't be touching a gun. And it should be, it's a much easier conversation than the conversation about sex or drugs or alcohol, I think. They're tools and they're not toys. And I don't think it's anything that anybody should be afraid of. And when Uvalde happened, I told my boys, I was like, this is what happens when people have guns. Okay, and you have to be able to have those hard conversations if you want your kids to understand that. So thank you for being here tonight, and I just wanted to challenge how people think about this issue, because it's important to me.
Don't go away. We'll stay.
No, and Jay, thank you for that. I mean, that's exactly the reason we're having this conversation tonight. We're not here to, talk about our accomplishments. We have a lot to do. And, I'm one of the reasons that this panel's here. I dragged them out here to Needham because I fortunately work at Mass General, and I know the great research that they're doing. I don't work supporting, in full disclosure, I do fundraising, but I don't support this group. This is kind of a side hustle, but I think they've been...
I got a polar soda.
Yes. I mean, yes. But I think they were being a little modest about the lack of funding. I mean, there's a lot of questions that we still have on the topic of gun violence prevention, and cholera got more funding than gun violence prevention, where it's killing 45,000 Americans a year. That's the same amount of liver disease. I staff cholangiocarcinoma, which is cancer that's derived from liver disease in some cases. And I can tell you tenfold, we get hundreds of millions of dollars of research for that. So we should definitely be putting some resources toward understanding these questions and getting to the data of how many school, active shooter drills should we have? Is it affecting kids? These are questions, these are open-ended questions. But this was part of my goal tonight, was to have this conversation in our community, because that's where we live and that's where our kids go to school. So I appreciate everyone's time tonight. Before you go, if you would please take a cookie or 5. You'll see that there's a business card. I mean, the goal tonight was education and a conversation. Obviously, they need funding, but you can save the QR code for the holiday time. You can give $25 tonight. It's more just knowing about the program and knowing that they need money. This is something that we need to fund ultimately. But I want to thank all of the panelists tonight and everyone for coming, and the Needham channel and Representative Garlick. It's been a really good conversation, and I hope to have more.
Thank you.